Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The dull hum of machinery echoed through the narrow corridors of the Ember 9 base as Elias Quinn ran a diagnostic scan on the worn-out engines. The smell of grease and scorched metal hung heavy in the air, and the blinking red lights above his workstation were a constant reminder that humanity's last defense line was crumbling. Everyone knew the end was near. The Zurich, with their towering war machines and nearly invincible technology, had backed humanity into a corner, this last, desolate rock of a planet that he wiped sweat from his brow, smearing grease across his pale skin. Elias wasn't a soldier. He had never been one of the brave warriors charging into the heat of battle. He was just a technician, a fixer, the guy people overlooked. In his corner of the world, Elias had found comfort in being invisible, working behind the scenes to keep the machinery running, making sure the fleet didn't fall apart before it was blown to pieces by alien fire. But today, things were different. Today, it was all about survival. The Omega Core, the Zurich's ultimate weapon, had been unleashed, and no one, not even the brilliant strategists in the human fleet, had a solution for stopping it. There were no more plans, no more clever maneuvers left to try. In just a few hours, everything Elias had ever known could be gone, erased from existence by the Zurich's terrifying power. His data scanner beeped softly, pulling him from his grim thoughts. Elias glanced at the readout on his console. The energy signature from the Omega Core's latest attack still rippled through the airwaves, even here, millions of miles away. The numbers didn't make sense. He frowned, tapping a few keys to run the data again. He had seen these readings before, right after the Zurich had vaporized 3 of their largest military stations. But something was off. The door to his workshop slid open with a hiss, and a voice broke through the steady hum of the engines. "Quinn. Commander Kane wants everyone to the war room, now." Elias turned, recognizing Lieutenant Corbin, one of the field officers. His face was drawn, eyes heavy with fatigue and the same desperation that seemed to hang over every soldier in the base. "I'm almost done with this," Elias replied, waving toward the console. "I just need to finish running the—" "No time for that," Corbin cut him off sharply. "We need every hand on deck. The final strike's coming." Elias hesitated, glancing back at the data. He could feel it in his gut that something about the Omega Core wasn't right. But Corbin was already heading down the corridor, and Elias wasn't about to argue. He grabbed his tool belt and followed. The war room was a dimly lit cavern, filled with holographic displays, tactical maps, and a crowd of anxious officers and soldiers. At the center stood Commander Lila Kane, her jaw set in the hard, determined way that had earned her the respect of the entire fleet. Elias slipped quietly into the back of the room, unnoticed as usual. "We're out of time," Kane's voice cut through the low murmur. "The Omega Core's next attack will hit Ember 9 in less than 4 hours. If we can't stop it, this planet, and every last one of us on it, will be gone." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one needed to ask what that meant. The Omega Core had already decimated every major human outpost on the outer colonies. Now it was here, aiming for the heart of the fleet's last stronghold. Kane's steely gaze swept over the room. "I won't sugarcoat it. Our chances aren't good. But we still have a fleet, and we still have our minds. We've fought this long, we're not about to go down without one hell of a fight." Elias's eyes flicked to the holographic display of the Omega Core. The Zurich weapon floated in space, surrounded by a deadly swarm of battleships, its enormous black core pulsing with energy. He could feel the weight of it, pressing down on them all. There was no weapon humanity had that could counter that kind of power. his thoughts drifted back to the data he'd been analyzing in the workshop. That energy signature, it didn't behave like anything he'd ever seen. But there was a rhythm to it, a pattern beneath the chaos. Maybe, just maybe, it could be manipulated. Before he knew it, Elias was speaking, his voice breaking through the silence. "Commander Kane." All heads turned toward him. Elias felt his face flush under the sudden attention, but he swallowed his nerves and forced himself to continue. "I've been running scans on the Omega Core's energy output. There's a fluctuation in its core readings. It's subtle, but it's there." Kane's sharp eyes narrowed on him. "A fluctuation?" "Yes," Elias said, more confidently now. "I think it's a weakness. The core isn't stable, it's running on a complex algorithm that manages its energy flow. If we can disrupt that algorithm, we might be able to destabilize the weapon." The room fell silent again, this time with a different kind of tension. Kane took a step toward him, her eyes boring into his. "Are you suggesting we hack into the Omega Core?" Elias nodded, his pulse quickening. "It's risky, but if we can gain access to their systems, I might be able to rewrite the algorithm and shut the weapon down." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Lieutenant Corbin scoffed from the back of the room. "You're out of your mind, Quinn. That thing's protected by more firepower than we've got in our entire fleet. You'd never get close." Elias clenched his fists. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew machines. He knew systems. And he knew when something was broken. "It's our only chance," he said quietly. "If we don't try, we'll be wiped out." Kane studied him for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Quinn. You've got a team. We'll get you to the Zurich flagship." Elias's heart raced. He had never expected this. But there was no turning back now. Elias stood stunned as the weight of the moment settled on him. His mind raced, cycling through the scenarios. This was the mission that could decide everything, his first time on the front lines, and it had to be this. No more hiding in the engine room, no more slipping under the radar. His hands, usually steady over the controls, now trembled slightly. Commander Kane wasted no time. She began barking orders to the officers around her, directing them to prepare for the mission. Elias knew this wasn't going to be easy, nothing involving the Zurich ever was. But this? Infiltrating the heart of their fleet, hacking into their most secure systems? It was insane. And yet, here he was, standing on the precipice of something that could either save humanity or doom it completely. Before he could fully process it, Kane was in front of him again, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "You've got one shot at this, Quinn. We'll provide cover, but once you're in there, it's all on you. I hope you're ready." Elias nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "I'll do what I have to." The team was assembled quickly, 3 soldiers hand-picked for their skill in stealth missions. Lieutenant Corbin, much to Elias's dismay, was part of the crew. Corbin didn't look happy about it either, but Kane had insisted on having one of her best men along for the ride. The others, Sergeant Lena Marsh, a sniper and infiltration expert, and Private Tarek, a communications specialist, seemed more neutral toward Elias. They didn't know him well, but they didn't dismiss him either. That was enough for now. The transport ship hummed as it prepared for launch, its interior dimly lit with a cold, sterile light. Elias found a seat in the corner, away from the others, and pulled up his data pad. He had to focus, running simulations of what he expected to find in the Zurich systems. calculating possible entry points, rehearsing his plan over and over in his mind. Anything to keep his nerves in check. The ship's engines roared to life, and they were off. The mission briefing was short: get in, disable the Omega core, get out. Simple, but not really. Corbin sat across from him, his helmet in his lap, eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't said a word since they'd left, but Elias could feel the tension between them like a knife edge. "You better not screw this up, Quinn," Corbin finally muttered, his voice low. Elias didn't look up from his datapad. "I know what's at stake." "Good. Because if you don't get that thing offline, none of us are getting out of this alive." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the ship. Elias tried not to think about it, about how impossible this mission was, about how many people were counting on him. His mind raced through the code again, finding the patterns, the anomalies, the places where he could disrupt the flow. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sergeant Marsh stood up, securing her gear. "Approaching the target. Prepare for boarding." The ship shuddered as it entered the Zurich fleet's perimeter. Alarms sounded, and Elias's heart rate spiked as the walls of the transport shook with the first wave of enemy fire. The soldiers were already moving, strapping on their helmets, checking their weapons. He fumbled with his own gear, securing his pack of hacking tools and the portable uplink device that would give him a chance at cracking the Omega core. The hull groaned as the ship made contact with the Zurich cruiser. There was a brief moment of weightlessness as the docking mechanism locked in, and then they were in. The hatch hissed open, and the team moved quickly, slipping through the breach into the belly of the Zurich warship. The air inside was cold, sterile, like everything else about the Zurich. Elias could feel his breath quicken as they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, following the map his datapad displayed. He tried to keep his focus on the task at hand, not on the alien architecture or the distant echoes of machinery that seemed to grow louder with every step. Marsh led the way, her movements swift and precise, her eyes scanning the hallways for any sign of the enemy. Corbin was close behind, his rifle held steady, ready to engage at the first hint of trouble. Elias stayed in the middle of the group, his hands clutching the datapad as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. As they neared the central control chamber, the tension escalated. The hum of alien machinery surrounded them, the walls glowing faintly with the pulsating energy that powered the Omega core. Elias felt the vibrations under his feet, knew they were close to the source. "Movement ahead," Marsh whispered, her voice barely audible over the comms. She motioned for the group to take cover behind a series of crates stacked along the corridor. Elias's breath caught in his throat as a squad of Zurich soldiers passed by, their enormous, insectoid forms barely fitting in the corridor. Their heavy exoskeletons glinted under the dim light, and their eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the area with a mechanical precision that sent a chill down his spine. "Stay low," Marsh ordered. They waited until the Zurich passed, their footsteps fading into the distance. Elias could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Corbin glanced back at him, his expression unreadable behind his helmet, but Elias could sense the unspoken warning in the man's eyes. They pressed on, finally reaching the control room. Elias's datapad confirmed it. This was the heart of the Omega core's operation. The door was sealed with a massive, alien lock, but Elias had prepared for this. He knelt beside the control panel, pulling out a series of thin, delicate tools, and began working on bypassing the lock's encryption. "Can you do it?" Corbin hissed, his eyes darting toward the hallway. Elias didn't respond, too focused on the lines of code flashing across his screen. It was more complex than he had expected. The Zurich had encrypted their systems with layers upon layers of code, but he was good at this. He could see the patterns, the weaknesses. His fingers flew over the keys, and with a final, decisive keystroke, the lock disengaged, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the control room. It was massive, dominated by a central console that pulsed with the same eerie energy that powered the Omega core. The walls were lined with strange, alien machinery, their functions inscrutable to anyone but the Zurich. Elias moved quickly to the console, pulling out his portable uplink and connecting it to the alien systems. His datapad flashed with streams of unfamiliar code as he began the process of hacking into the Omega core's control algorithm. "This is it," he muttered to himself, his fingers moving over the keys with practiced precision. He had to be fast. The Zurich would notice the intrusion any moment now, and there wouldn't be time for second chances. Suddenly, alarms blared through the ship. Elias cursed under his breath. They had been detected. "We've got company," Corbin shouted, raising his rifle as Zurich soldiers stormed into the hallway. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of gunfire filled the air. Marsh and Tarek returned fire, their shots precise, but the Zurich were relentless. Elias could barely hear anything over the chaos, but he forced himself to focus on the code in front of him. The algorithm was complex, but he was getting closer. He could feel it. A loud crash echoed through the control room as one of the Zurich soldiers broke through the line. Elias didn't look up. His fingers flew across the keys, faster now, almost instinctively. The algorithm was unraveling before him, the weakness in the core system becoming clearer with every keystroke. "I'm almost there," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Corbin grunted in response, his attention focused on keeping the Zurich at bay. The room felt like it was closing in on Elias, the walls shrinking, the sound of battle growing louder and louder. But he kept going. The final line of code flashed across his screen, and with a final tap, the Omega core system collapsed. The alien machinery in the room sputtered, the lights flickering as the core's energy output destabilized. Elias barely had time to process it before the entire ship shuddered violently, the Omega core beginning to tear itself apart. "Move now!" Corbin shouted, grabbing Elias by the arm and hauling him toward the exit. They ran. The sound of explosions echoed behind them as the Omega core's energy spiraled out of control, ripping through the Zurich fleet. Elias stumbled, barely able to keep up as they sprinted toward the waiting transport ship. The moment they were inside, the ship launched into the sky, speeding away from the Zurich cruiser as it disintegrated in a brilliant explosion of energy. Elias collapsed against the wall of the transport, his heart still racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had done it. They had actually done it.